It's good to be with you. Greetings from Westminster, and it's a joy to be with you in this conversation about the heritage of the Reformed Church, and especially in its expressions through the Leiden Synopsis. In his prefatory comments regarding the 6th edition of the Synopsis Purioris Theology, published in 1881, Herman Bavinck remarked, "For it was a handbook for students of theology, sweet and suitable, concise, bringing clear light to many and various matters, controversies with remonstrants and papists, in a manner keen, subtle, and perspicuous, yet without rancor or partisan zeal. And lastly, it was written by the 4 professors who, enjoying the trust and love of the church, due to both their piety and their learning, were esteemed by nearly everyone." It is this comment that invites us today to consider the relationship of 2 Leiden professors, Antonius Walaeus, 1573 to 1639, and Johannes Hoornbeeck, 1617 to 1666, to the Leiden Synopsis Purioris Theologiae. I'll examine 3 questions. First, how does Walaeus' disputation on the church relate to his other works? Second, how does Hoornbeeck's later teaching continue or modify this approach? And third, what does this reveal about the Synopsis Purioris, both as a stable text and also as a living pedagogical tradition? Before proceeding, please refer to the handout showing the 1654 disputational cycle at Leiden. Notice the asterisks marking disputations 9, 24, and 33. These mark where Hoornbeeck presided on a topic such as his disputation on the church, which I'll compare to Walaeus' foundational work. Both of these professors actually overlapped on these topics. And so you've got those points there. Walaeus was trained for pastoral ministry at Leiden. Hoornbeeck was trained primarily at the University of Utrecht, and basically due to the COVID of his day, had to withdraw. He interrupted his studies at Leiden because of a plague outbreak. And at the next university that he could go to was at Utrecht. So in that context, he was trained not only at Leiden for a brief time under Walaeus, but also then was trained under Flacius. That's a fascinating point of discussion. Both of these men served as professors of theology at Leiden. Walaeus served as professor at Leiden from shortly after the conclusion of the Synod of Dordrecht in 1619 until 1639. Hoornbeeck first served as a professor of theology at Utrecht from 1644 until 1654, and then from 1654 at Leiden until his death in 1666. Both participated in cycles of disputations as the presiding professors at pivotal moments in Leiden's history. After the Synod of Dordrecht, the joint composition of the Leiden Synopsis Purioris Theologiae by the 4 Leiden theologians, Polyander, Walaeus, Theseus, and Rivet, was followed by another joint composition of the Censures, aimed at the Remonstrant Confessions, which was penned chiefly by Episcopius with the involvement of other Remonstrant pastors. With respect to Hoornbeeck, we have an interesting twist in his ministerial training that I've referenced that should attract our attention. He had that privilege of studying under 2 key theologians, both at the History of Leiden and in the History of Utrecht. And this is particularly interesting for the history of missions as well, because Antonius Walaeus, as I'm sure you're aware, ran a foreign mission basically out of his home, preparing pastors for work in the Indies. So in that environment, you have a tantalizing possibility that the 10 years prior to Hoornbeeck's arrival at Leiden for training, Walaeus was involved in overseas missions. And here we have out of Hoornbeeck one of the best statements of what missions should be. It was recently published by Brill in translation on Hoornbeeck's work on the conversion of the Indians. And so this later work that was published posthumously on the conversion of the Indians is that fascinating insight into early modern Dutch Reformed thinking on missions, which was arguing at the time for missionary work independent of the trading companies and national interests. The salient point here is that there could be connections between Walaeus and Hoornbeeck in their understanding of missions, preaching, the doctrine of the church, and due to Hoornbeeck's direct contact and training with both Walaeus and Theseus. So why did Hoornbeeck go to Utrecht? Simple, plague. And then as he's trained there, he's part of and adopts the positions of the Natura Reformatio, the further reformation of piety. You can see this in his disputations. He's frequently talking about self-denial. He's talking about spiritual desertion. He's talking about all sorts of major emphases that you find at Utrecht. And he's even bringing them to Leiden as well. What's also interesting about Walaeus is you have an emphasis in Walaeus on theory and practice. So you have a theoretical, practical edge in Walaeus and some of his treatments. So there's quite a bit of overlap in this discussion. So now to Walaeus specifically. The relationship of Walaeus and his teaching to the Leiden Synopsis is of interest precisely because we have works of his that pre-exist the writing of the Synopsis Purioris, and he taught for another 14 years afterwards. It is therefore worth investigating his theological formulations prior to and after the publication of the Leiden Synopsis. With respect to Hoornbeeck, we have a professor at Leiden whose training as did his teaching career happened in both places. This consideration of Hoornbeeck illustrates how the Synopsis Purioris was being used by the middle and late period of the 17th centuries. Even though it's not replicating them, there's a point here to be made. You can see it on the handout of the order. There's overlap in the topics. Now they're moving things around, but there's a lot of overlap. And for some reason, it seems that the cycle under Hoornbeeck and Hydanis and Coxaeus was interrupted. So that's interesting. Consider the following. When Polyander delivered the funeral oration for his beloved colleague and friend, Antonius Walaeus, he reminded his audience of grieving family members, colleagues, scholars, students, and university curators that while ancient pagans might commend only the religion and piety of one deceased, quote, let us who have been taught far better by the Apostle Paul, who defines our theology as that knowledge of the truth which is according to piety, consider that we ought not only to praise our colleague's piety, but also his learning. Because Christ and his apostles taught that the foundation of our utmost felicity has been set down in both theoretical and practical theology. And certainly, just as the true knowledge of God and his works is the procreator of faith, so faith is the governor of the rest of the virtues that emanate from that knowledge. In fact, there is no true saving knowledge in us if we lack sincere piety towards God. But neither can any piety profit us for salvation if we lack the knowledge whereby true piety can be differentiated from the false, or the correct one from the crooked. Wherefore our fellow pastor Walaeus, of all that he did, whatever he taught, recited, or did, he set this goal for himself as his chief aim, to guard faithfully the excellent deposit of the truth conjoined with piety delivered to him by God. That language of theory wedded to practice, truth wedded to piety, you find that at Utrecht, and you see it here in Polyander. So there's a really interesting nexus. Polyander then proceeded to portray Walaeus' pious wisdom and wise piety through his chief works of theology. His excellence as a theologian, Polyander says, may be demonstrated in his theological commonplaces. His theoretical and practical theology may be commended by his oration on the instruction of theological study. But, quote, how orthodox and sound he was as a disputator. His 14 disputations display in our synopsis, which you have read thoroughly several times. Thus, I agree with Herman Bavinck's general estimation that these disputations are in fact a reliable and sufficient guide to the thought of the various professors involved. I also find no sufficient reason to disagree with the estimation of Johannes Polyander when he praised his colleague's 14 disputations in the Leiden Synopsis Purioris as evidence of his deceased friend's orthodoxy and skill in disputations. That is an odd comment if the priority of authorship and origination of formulation is conceived of as belonging chiefly to the student and not to the professor of record. It's a joint project, as many have said here. As to the relation of the Enchiridium, his disputation on the church and the Synopsis Purioris and the Loci Communes one to another, I concur with Dr. Jonathan Beeke's reasoning as to the relationship of dependence among the texts. The Enchiridium originated with Walaeus' teaching career at Middelburg, which began in 1606, and the Loci Communes was a more advanced project began once he entered his professorship in 1619. Walaeus' son observed, quote, thus he gave his Enchiridion of the Reformed religion to those being initiated into sacred ministry, whereby a smooth pathway might be made for them and the vestibule of theology opened to them. Once initiated, he thoroughly admitted them into his Loci Communes, and there revealed all things, close quote. That might be a bit of an overstated an overstatement given the textual evidence, but the Loci Communes do evidence more editing at some points and deepening at others. Furthermore, his son remarked, quote, "And those who accompanied him from the school at Middelburg to the Academy of Leiden prevailed upon him." The word in Latin there is extorted, like wrenched it from him. It's almost like torture, actually. But at any rate, to put it with more gentility, they prevailed upon him to give most of it to them. Thus, there are close resonances between some of the disputations and the prior Enchiridion. Likewise, there are instances where the disputations are developed more fully later in the Loci Communes. When we turn to Disputation 40 of Walaeus on the church, it covers, in the course of 51 theses, the Synopsis sets forth in general the Reformed doctrine of the church. But there are several noteworthy features here. Since it is primarily an overview of the doctrine of the Church Catholicos, or Church Universalis, it would not be surprising to note that throughout the disputation, the argument is closely exegeted and cross-referenced to over 120 passages of Scripture. I don't think that would surprise anyone here. It would also not surprise anyone, I think, that the most proximate target for critique consistently in this document is the Roman Catholic Church, at least with respect to general arguments of Protestants in this period opposing the Vatican's claim to papal supremacy, especially after the Council of Trent. The biblical etymology of the term ecclesia, as those called out, the assembly and gathering of, quote, "those whom the Lord calls out of the estate of nature to the supernatural estate of the children of God in order to demonstrate his glorious mercy," close quote. As the founder of the church, it includes only creatures created according to the image of God, and asserts the Synopsis also includes both men and angels, as we heard yesterday. In Thesis 8, the Synopsis addresses the first controverted point. What are the parts of the church considered in its entirety? Setting aside the questions of angels, we're going to now go where they perhaps fear to tread. He's disputing with Roman Catholics this question about what does the Catholic Church include. And for the Reformed, we're not surprised if we hear about the Church Militant or the Church Triumphant. But it's worth reminding us that the Catholic doctrine as argued by Bellarmine, the Roman Catholic doctrine argued by Bellarmine, includes one more category, those suffering in purgatory. And so while we're dealing with Bellarmine, who claims that the church includes those suffering in purgatory, those triumphing in heaven, and those militant on earth, it is important to note that this discussion is not a sympathetical statement in Bellarmine. The entirety of Bellarmine's 6 general controversy regarding the church is devoted to the question of purgatory and Christians who have died. What does that mean in terms of sheer scope and size? Well, 2 books, 30 chapters spanning a total of 80 columns on folio pages, or roughly about 40,000 words of theses, all covered by this one little gloss, right, in the Synopsis Purioris. So the disputation remarks, the 2 latter parts we freely acknowledge, but they have invented the 3rd part apart from the Word of God in order to clean out the money bags and oppress the souls of superstitious people with this spiritual slavery. Close quote. It's important to note that in this period in which the Synopsis was written, Protestants and Roman Catholics agree on the category of the triumphant church, but not on the content of that category. For example, Bellarmine takes the opportunity afforded by the doctrine of the blessed dead triumphing heaven to give a protracted argument devoted over the course of 50 chapters, longer than what he dealt with in other aspects of his treatment on purgatory. Over 50 chapters to take the opportunity of the triumphant church to talk about the role of the saints in liturgy. Over 50 chapters, the glory and worship of the saints, De Gloria et Cultu Sanctorum. He argues that the doctrine of the Church Triumphant must impact liturgical practice by moving from the starting point that the blessed dead do enjoy the beatific vision now, and thus are to be canonized by the Church, and on the authority of the Pope, do so as an act of faith among congregants. He also goes on to say that you can reverence saints who have not been canonized as long as you do it privately. From Thesis 9 onward in the Synopsis, the main issue is, what does it mean to be a part of the universal and true church? In order to refute the arguments regarding a portion of the church as being in purgatory, Walaeus defends the immortality of the soul. as well as the felicity and beatitude of believers who have died. He argues these are necessary components of the correct doctrine of the church. And while this may be an obvious argument to make against purgatory in the Roman Catholic Church, there are other proximate confessional groups. Walaeus is defending the doctrine of the immortality of the soul in the true church in the early 17th century Dutch context against Socinians and Anabaptists and libertines. And then there's this enticing comment, and similar heretics. Who were they? But the issue for him in that context is this issue of those who hold to soul sleep. The cluster of passages that he rallies to defend the immortality of the soul are Ecclesiastes 12:9, which admittedly is posed as a question. For even if the body should return to the earth as it was, yet the spirit would return to God who gave it. And Matthew 10:28, as the Lord says, and even though they may slay the bodies of the godly, yet they cannot kill their souls. Walaeus also takes aim at the Roman Catholic doctrine of purgatory with a classic Protestant text, Revelation 14:13. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord, aparti. Henceforth, that is, from this time forth, they rest from their labors and their works follow them. Close quote. Also, Walaeus argues that when believers die, they cease from their labors and they rest, which means that they cannot return to earth to work on behalf of the living. Also, much less return to their homes. King David's remark in 2 Samuel 12:23 is apropos here, that since his son cannot return to him, he will eventually go to him in death. What is of interest is that the only remotely contemporary theologian mentioned by name in this entire disputation is Bellarmine. By mentioning Bellarmine, the point of comparison must locate one focus of debate upon his disputations upon controversies of the Christian faith, which was first published in 1586 and rapidly became not only the most prominent defense of the Council of Trent, but the most obvious lightning rod for most of Protestant scholasticism in the late 16th century, in the 17th. Also, just to give you a sense of publication history, it was published in Ingolstadt in 1586, Venice in 1596, Paris in 1608, Prague in 1721, and Rome in 1832. And by the way, since 2017, the Controversies are being translated and published into English. So the modern Reformed Church is going to have to be very aware of the ressourcement of Bellarmine. Coupled with his treatise on the power of the Supreme Pontiff and temporal affairs in 1610, these two works, the Controversies and the argument about the supreme power of the Pope, function in this context. And perhaps it is evident why the Synopsis charts the path that it does. Within the subtext of this argument with Bellarmine, simmering just beneath the surface are deeper arguments on the authority of Scripture, the nature of the Church, and who is on the right side of the Church Fathers. The patristic and medieval authorities mentioned at points in this disputation on the Church are Cyprian of Carthage, Augustine of Hippo, and Thomas Aquinas, on such matters as the true Church, heresy, schism, and the unity of the Church. You actually see that comment. You can't say you have the God as your father if the church is not your mother. That's invoked by Walaeus in light of Galatians 4:26. But the Jerusalem that is above is free. With respect to Augustine and Thomas, their inclusion regards the distinction of the visible church and the marks to determine where the true church is. In Thesis 35, we hear that the visible church is never so pure or sincere that there are not hypocrites and the ungodly mix therein. In Thesis 37, the visible church with respect to this doctrine and morals is either pure or impure. And again, the impure are either simply erring, heretical, or schismatic. In Thesis 38, an erring church safeguards and fosters at least some errors, but it does not overturn the foundation of faith, namely Christ and his office. And yet it would be prepared daily to advance and correct its errors according to the command of God, were it convinced of them. Close quote. But in Thesis 39, a heretical church, properly speaking, is one that so errs in the fundamental articles and of such grave moment and then perseveres stubbornly in them. It is further emphasized here that stubbornness and error concerns the formal reason of heresy. A heretical church that directly undermines the foundations, that is, Christ and his office, are called antichrist and apostate. But if indirectly or by consequence, then they are false prophets or false teachers. Schismatics, properly speaking here, are those that agree in the foundation, but on account of adiaphora matters and externals, or even lapses in morals, rupture Christian communion and fellowship and form separate congregations. Here, Walaeus invokes Augustine and Thomas positively. Walaeus alluded to the more lengthy passage in chapter 10 of Faith and the Creed, citing this much: For both heretics and schismatics style their congregations churches, but heretics, in holding false opinions regarding God, do injury to the faith itself, while schismatics, on the other hand, in wicked separation, break off from brotherly love, although they may believe just what we believe. But consider Augustine's further point here, which is pastoral. When he specifies a lack of brotherly love as a mark of schism, Augustine says this: "Wherefore neither do the heretics belong to the church universal, which loves God, nor do the schismatics form a part of the same, inasmuch as it loves the neighbor, and consequently readily forgives the neighbor's sins, because it prays that forgiveness may be extended to itself by him who has reconciled us to himself, doing away with all past things and calling us to a new life. And until we reach the perfection of this new life, we cannot be without sins." On Aquinas, the citation is from question 39 of the second part of the second half of the second part in the Respondeo. Here, Walaeus notes the point that schism is a willful and intentional separation from the unity of the church. However, the utility of this quote for the Reform can only be taken apart from how Thomas actually ends the paragraph on Colossians 2:18 through 19 on the unity of the body under the head, with this interpolation by Aquinas. Between Christ and the body of church, here's what Aquinas says on this same quote that Walaeus uses. Quote, "Now this head is Christ himself, whose vice-regent is the sovereign pontiff. Wherefore schismatics are those who refuse to submit to the sovereign pontiff and to hold communion with those members of the church who acknowledge his supremacy." Close quote. Perhaps it is the remainder of the quote in Aquinas that will stimulate the need for Disputation 41. Christ, the head of the church, and the Antichrist in the Synopsis, based around 2 Corinthians 2:11 and following. In the Enchiridium, Walaeus addresses the marks of the church much as you would expect: the primacy of the word and the right administration of the sacraments, together with the ancillary mark of discipline. In the Enchiridium, you have a more ample treatment of objections, whereas in the Synopsis, we have here the mention of Bellman, an allusion to his schema of additional marks, that is, antiquity, succession of persons, amplitude or multitude, and miracles. In the Enchiridium, Walaeus takes the time, actually, to demonstrate, watch how he does this. At a time when Roman Catholics are telling the Reformed, you're innovating, you don't have antiquity, you're doing something brand new. Listen to how he responds to that. In the Enchiridium, he takes the time to demonstrate that the Pharisees boasted in their antiquity. And by the way, there was a time when the Apostolic Church was younger than the Pharisaic Church. And that equally, the same point applies to the succession of persons and amplitude. It even applies to the question of miracles. How so? Well, if you count the sons of Sceva, then the Pharisaic church had miracles too. Thus, these four marks are historically falsifiable, is what Walaeus is pointing out. Furthermore, says Walaeus, the Greek church can boast of antiquity, succession, amplitude, and miracles of their own saints. On the other hand, the three marks of the Reformed could be traced all the way back to the earliest days of believers since the fall. Now, as we turn to Hoornbeeck, as he served as a professor at Leiden for 12 years from 1644 until his death, we should consider them together because we're seeing how the Synopsis is being repackaged and reused. When Hoornbeeck served on the faculty, he was already recognizable as a prominent, albeit junior, member of the Nata Reformatie. As others have closely studied this movement, a discussion of the Dutch Further Reformation need not detain us long. The primary emphasis of this movement between 1580 and the days of John Taffen, with his marks of the children of God, attest well that orthodoxy and piety must be linked. We've seen that in other places at Leiden and at Utrecht. In Hoornbeeck, this Utrecht-trained pastor and theologian exemplified this emphasis upon personal closing with Christ, as well as comfort in the promises of God in his preaching. Consider that throughout the 1650s, he penned works on self-denial, faith, access of the soul to Christ, desperation of one's own salvation, the good of being alone, and the certainty of salvation, the sense of divine grace, and on sincerity and hypocrisy. In Hoornbeeck, one has not only an Orthodox theologian, but a theologian academically treating matters of pastoral concern. With respect to the cycle of disputations at Leiden throughout the 1650s, he was the junior colleague alongside Abraham Hadanus and Johannes Cocceius. How does this cycle of disputations compare to the Synopsis Purioris? In terms of content, there are noticeable consolidations within the framework. You can see this. Disputations 1 through 5 match the Leiden Synopsis exactly. And then, on the other hand, you start seeing points where they actually place the doctrine of predestination That's an interesting observation as well. The handout illustrates that consolidation I'm describing. Note how 1 through 5 align with the original synopsis, but Disputation 9 on predestination has shifted position. The synopsis placed predestination in the order of topics after the treatment of the Old and New Testament, but before the incarnation. Here, the doctrine of predestination is placed between the doctrine of the Trinity and the creation of the world, as well as providence. What I'm calling the ordinary theological disputations of Hoornbeeck then stay in step from topic 10 through the topic 18, the law of God. At that point, Hydanus takes up the question of the covenant of grace in the Old and New Testament. As an aside, in this particular cycle, it is interesting that Hydanus and not Coxaeus is the one taking students through the dispensations of the covenant of grace. Turning our attention to the disputation over which Hoornbeeck presided on the church, this is Disputation 33 on your handout on De Ecclesia. Notice its placement in the sequence. First, I should note that it is, in one sense, brief at only 20 theses. But fair warning, these theses are rather dense. Some of them stretch over 2 pages, which is different than the Leiden synopsis. I mean, you might get 2 or 3 sentences, but here you get a deepening. Here's how Hoornbeeck starts his discussion of what the church is. Remember, in Walaeus, it's a called-out community. We've seen that yesterday and some today. Hoornbeeck says this: that church in divine predestination has been hidden as in an abyss from eternity, as also to its cause. Hence, it is also rightly comprehended in the satisfaction of Christ, whether promised or provided. It emerges at last and is exhibited in the world, and thence its name is allotted. For it means the assembly of persons called out of the world by the preaching of the word. And because calling is considered either as it is exercised by people and among people, or as it is directed by God. And that's the basis of the visible and invisible church. If it's with relevance to, if it's in relation to human beings, visible and invisible. And then he says this. You find similarities, by the way, with Walaeus here, as you'd expect. But on the question of the visibility of the church in Theses 2 and 3, Hoornbeeck notes that it depends on the vantage point. He said he's very careful to say this: at no time is the true church invisible to God. But the visibility or invisibility of the church is a consideration from the vantage point of humanity and with respect to the profession of the church, as with respect to its rule. In Thesis 4, Hoornbeeck articulates a similar point as Walaeus on the perpetuity of the church, and that it will not ultimately fail. That's pretty common and stable at this point. From Thesis 5 through 9, Hoornbeeck takes up the classic marks of the church and shares more commonly with the objections Walaeus makes in his Enchiridium, which is interesting. He actually takes up some of the things that are more specific in the Enchiridium of Walaeus, it seems. I'm not saying that there's necessarily dependence there, but it's interesting that he starts rallying more of his argument that didn't make it into the disputation at Leiden earlier. He uses that, and he specifically uses Walaeus's argument in the Enchiridium and those other contexts about the issue of antiquity, succession, multitude, amplitude, and so forth. He even goes after the Lutherans at some points. Now he adds debates with Lapide, actually, here, which extends the argument beyond de Bellarmine. In Thesis 8, he packs in a discussion of the purity or impurity of the church, the issue of erring, schismatic and heretical churches, all in one space where that's spread out in the synopsis. In Article 10, he takes up the issue of the locality of the church, whether in Jerusalem, Constantinople, or Rome. In Article 12, the issue of an infallible judge of controversies is denounced as a figment of Rome. And from this point, there is some discussion of what 1 Timothy 3:5 means with respect to the pillar and ground of the truth, concluding that it cannot be Peter, otherwise Paul would have mentioned it. All focus in these theses from Article 13 onward is upon the debate with Rome. Thesis 17 takes up almost 2 whole pages dealing with historical arguments over the patristic witness, and he's engaging directly with Roman Catholic historians at that point and their invocation of the patristic witness. In Thesis 19, there's also a brief treatment of the sole headship of Christ over the church. That's dealt with more at length later in this cycle, but he at least mentions it here. Which is interesting because this is supposed to deal with Remonstrants and Roman Catholics. Well, we've gone through 19 theses and it's all Roman Catholics. And then almost as an afterthought in Thesis 20, in less than 6 lines with a quick elbow, Hoornbeeck only notes that Socinians and Remonstrants do not accept the visible and invisible distinction of the church. And he doesn't say anything else. And leaves you wondering. So then, as abruptly as Hoornbeeck ended, I'm going to come to this point. So what are our findings so far with this comparison? Can we say with Bobbing that the Leiden Synopsis has brought clear light to various matters? First, we see with respect to the Leiden Synopsis Purioris that the disputations must be researched not only in concert with the cycle of disputations as they were repeated by various faculty and students, indicating that the concepts and orderings are somewhat stable, but we must also look to the corpus of a professor, both their antecedent work and their consequent work, to the composition and defense of those theses. Secondly, the ordering of the disputations in subsequent cycles could be altered and often were by other professors. Here is where we see development either in terms of addition, revision, deepening, or summation. In praise of saying that later view actually holds it out as an intended series, if you were to look at this ordinary set of disputations, the first set in this one that Hoornbeeck's involved in has a grand title page. And it lists all three professors, even though the first one only has one professor over it, indicating that they intended to make this into a larger series. So there's this ordering issue as well. The ordering of the disputations in subsequent cycles could be altered. In the case of Hoornbeeck, we see points elaborated in Walaeus and the Enchiridium and in the Loci Communes that are brought into his disputation cycle with more intentionality and more deepening. Third, whereas the Leiden Synopsis is rather economical in its citation and allusions to its polemical targets, later generations expounded and expanded upon their work, indicating that in some measure the path was brighter and clearer on particular polemical issues. As the handout demonstrates visually, while the Synopsis provided a stable framework, the 1654 cycle shows both continuity as well as creative adaptation. And perhaps this is the best point to stop at the moment with this observation. While the Leiden Synopsis Purioris under Walaeus, Polyander, Theseus, and Rivet are described as purer, in the middle of the century, in various ways, latter disputations in their detail, length, and breadth are more appropriately described as fuller. Thank you.